Welcome back to another intense story of love, betrayal, and ruthless revenge. Imagine dedicating your life to someone, only to find out they were stabbing you in the back the whole time. What would you do if the people you trusted the most shattered your world? Well, today's story is about a man who didn't just walk away, he made sure they paid for every lie, every betrayal. Buckle up, because this is going to be a wild ride. John always believed in discipline, loyalty, and honor, values that had been ingrained in him through years of military service. He had seen war zones, experienced the deafening chaos of battle, and endured sleepless nights where survival was never guaranteed. Yet, nothing gave him more comfort than coming back home to Sarah. She was his anchor, the love of his life, the reason he fought so hard. Their marriage wasn't just built on love but on trust, or so he thought. Sarah had been there for him through every deployment, sending him letters filled with promises of forever, waiting for his return with open arms. Whenever he came back home, she made him feel like the luckiest man alive. Their small but cozy home, the warm dinners she prepared, the way she laughed at his corny military jokes, everything felt perfect. But perfection is a fragile thing. Sarah had always been social, friendly to everyone, and John never thought much of it. But Mike, her sister's husband, had a different kind of presence in their lives. He was always around, sometimes too much. Whether it was a casual family dinner or a weekend gathering, Mike was there, always laughing a little too hard at Sarah's jokes, always standing a little too close. John brushed it off. After all, Mike was family. Mike was charming in a way that John wasn't. While John was hardened by years of discipline, Mike was relaxed, a smooth talker, someone who could charm his way into any room. He was a businessman, the kind who always had a deal going, always had excuses for why things weren't working out. John never really liked that about him, but he wasn't the jealous type. He had faith in Sarah. Faith can be blinding. There were little things John ignored. The way Sarah's phone screen would light up late at night, only for her to turn it over with a nervous flick of her wrist. The way Mike would make jokes about how Sarah must get lonely when John was deployed, only for Sarah to laugh a little too quickly. The way Sarah would defend Mike, even when John made casual remarks about how unreliable he was. Then there were the unexplained absences. Sarah had started coming home later than usual, blaming it on errands or last-minute plans with her sister. Some days, she seemed distant, lost in thought, her phone always within arm's reach. John noticed, of course he did. But he told himself he was overthinking. She loves me. She wouldn't betray me. After all, he had risked his life for his country. The least life could do was grant him a loyal wife. That night, as John lay in bed beside Sarah, listening to her slow, steady breathing, he pushed the doubts away. He was home now. That was all that mattered. Or so he thought. John had always imagined his homecoming to be special. After months away on deployment, he pictured Sarah running into his arms, tears in her eyes, whispering how much she missed him. That thought had kept him going through the long, restless nights in a foreign land. But life had a way of twisting expectations. He had come back 2 days early, a surprise he had planned for weeks. In his hands were Sarah's favorite white lilies and a small velvet box carrying a delicate bracelet he had picked up from a local artisan overseas. The excitement in his chest grew as he pulled into their driveway. The house stood there, quiet and familiar, but something about it felt off. He stepped inside, expecting the comforting scent of home, maybe the lingering warmth of candles, the faint aroma of Sarah's cooking. Instead, the air smelled stale, as if the windows hadn't been opened in days. A couple of dishes sat carelessly in the sink, unusual for Sarah, who always kept things spotless. His eyes swept the room, noting small but peculiar details, a blanket hastily thrown over the couch, a wine glass on the coffee table with a faint smudge of lipstick, and next to it, an empty beer can. John's stomach tightened. Mike was the only one who drank that brand. His fingers curled around the bouquet, the soft petals crushed slightly under his tightening grip. He told himself it meant nothing. Maybe Sarah had company, maybe she had his sister and Mike over recently. And yet, something inside him stirred. Then came the hesitation. Sarah emerged from the hallway, her hair slightly disheveled, her expression frozen in shock before quickly morphing into an awkward smile. "John? Oh my God, you're home early." She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him, but something in her embrace felt forced. He held onto her, breathing in her familiar scent, yet beneath the perfume, there was something else, a faint trace of cologne he didn't recognize. Sarah pulled back, eyes darting around the room as if checking for something. "You should have told me, I would have cleaned up," she said, laughing nervously. John studied her face, searching for warmth, for the happiness he had expected. Instead, there was unease, as if his presence had disrupted something. He forced a smile, lifting the bouquet. "Wanted to surprise you." She took the flowers, holding them awkwardly, before setting them down too quickly, barely glancing at them. Normally, she would gush over every petal, press them to her nose, and joke about how he always remembered her favorites. But tonight, she barely even acknowledged them. His eyes flickered back to the beer can. His mind ran through the possibilities, his military instincts kicking in. The house wasn't just messy, it was rushed, as if someone had left in a hurry. His grip tightened around the gift in his pocket. Something wasn't right. And for the first time, the thought crept into his mind, what if he wasn't imagining things? John had spent years relying on his instincts in the field, trusting that gut feeling when something felt off. It had saved his life more times than he could count. And now, standing in his own home, surrounded by familiar walls that suddenly felt foreign, that same instinct kicked in. Something wasn't right. He didn't ask Sarah about the beer can. He didn't mention the hesitation in her hug or the way her hands trembled slightly when she set the flowers down. Instead, he did what he had been trained to do, he observed. Over the next few days, John watched Sarah more closely than ever before. Her habits had changed. She was on her phone more, tilting the screen away from him when he walked by. Late at night, when she thought he was asleep, he could hear the faint, rapid tapping of her fingers on the screen. Whenever he asked who she was texting, she would give a different answer each time, her sister, a friend from work, an old college roommate. Small lies, but John knew that small lies were often used to cover up bigger ones. Then there were the phone calls. She never used to take calls in the bathroom, but now, she would excuse herself during dinner, locking the door behind her. He once caught a muffled giggle through the thin wooden door. When she emerged, her smile vanished the moment she saw him standing there. "Who was that?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. She hesitated, just for a second. "Just my sister." Another lie. John didn't react, not yet. He needed more than just gut feelings. He needed proof. One night, as Sarah showered, John did something he never thought he'd do. He went through her phone. But just as he picked it up from the nightstand, the screen flashed, Face ID required. She had changed her password. His heart pounded in his chest, not with anger, but with confirmation. She had never locked her phone from him before. Why now? Then came the final clue, the one that made his blood turn to ice. John had been away for 6 months. He knew every detail of their bedroom, from the way Sarah folded the blankets to the subtle scent of her lotion that lingered on the pillows. But tonight, as he sat on the edge of the bed, something was different. A faint scent clung to the sheets, cologne. But not his. The realization was suffocating. He gripped the fabric between his fingers, breathing in the unfamiliar scent, his mind racing through every possibility. There were none. No one else should have been in their bedroom. His military training kicked in. Stay calm. Gather intel. Strike when the time is right. Sarah walked in, her damp hair clinging to her shoulders. She noticed his expression, the tension in his jaw. You okay? John forced a small smile, tucking away the rage simmering beneath the surface. Yeah. Just thinking. She smiled back, relieved. But she had no idea. John wasn't just thinking. He was planning. John knew he couldn't rely on suspicions alone. He needed proof. Cold, undeniable evidence that would strip away any lingering doubt. He had spent years gathering intelligence in the military, tracking enemies, setting up recon operations. Now, he was doing the same thing in his own home. The plan was simple: pretend to leave, then watch. That morning, over breakfast, he casually mentioned an out-of-town errand. I have to handle some paperwork at the base, he said, sipping his coffee. Might stay overnight if it runs late. Sarah barely looked up from her phone. Oh, yeah, of course. Do what you need to do. No hesitation. No disappointment. No questions about when he'd be back. It was all John needed to hear. An hour later, he packed a small bag, grabbed his keys, and kissed Sarah goodbye. He even backed his truck out of the driveway, making sure she heard the familiar hum of the engine fading down the street. But instead of heading to the base, he parked a few blocks away and walked back silently, carefully, like he'd done in enemy territory before. Before leaving, he had installed 2 hidden cameras, one in the living room, angled toward the couch, and another in the bedroom, hidden among the books on the shelf. Tiny, undetectable, perfectly placed. He also left a small voice recorder tucked beneath the bed frame. If anything happened, he would know. Now, all he had to do was wait. Hours passed. He sat in his truck, his laptop screen open, watching the live feed. Sarah had been alone at first, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing at the clock. Then, just after 7 p.m., there was a knock at the door. John leaned forward, his pulse steady but his grip tightening on the laptop. Sarah rushed to answer, her entire posture shifting, from casual to eager. She barely checked through the peephole before opening the door. And there he was. Mike. John's breathing slowed. His world shrank to the screen in front of him. Mike stepped inside with the ease of a man who had done this before. No hesitation. No nervousness. He carried a 6-pack of beer, the same brand John had found in the trash. They talked at first, too quietly for the microphone to catch everything, but John didn't need the words. The body language was enough. Sarah laughed, not the polite kind she gave strangers, but the soft, intimate kind John used to hear when she was truly happy. She touched Mike's arm as she poured them drinks. Then, slowly, the conversation faded, and the distance between them disappeared. John's fingers dug into his knees as he watched his wife lean into another man, his own brother-in-law. Then came the moment that shattered everything. Mike reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind Sarah's ear. She didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. And then, they kissed. John's breath left his body, but his face remained stone-cold. He had been trained for high-pressure situations, to think clearly even when under attack. But nothing could have prepared him for this. His hands shook as he adjusted the camera feed, watching them move toward the bedroom. His bedroom. The place where he had once held Sarah close, whispered promises into her ear, dreamed of a future together. Now, that same bed was a graveyard for his love, a place where betrayal unfolded in real time. A deep, crushing pain settled in his chest, but still, he didn't move. He didn't scream. He didn't break. John simply watched. Because soon, they would pay. John had been betrayed before, but never like this. In war, the enemy was clear. The lines were drawn, the objectives defined. But this was personal. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to storm into that house, to let his rage take over, to make them pay right then and there. But he wasn't just any man, he was a soldier, trained to strike with precision, not impulse. If he wanted real justice, he had to be patient. They thought they had one. Sarah and Mike had no idea their every move had been recorded, that their whispered promises and stolen kisses were now digital evidence in John's hands. But simple revenge wasn't enough. John didn't just want to hurt them, he wanted to destroy them. John had spent years in military intelligence, working alongside cyber teams that cracked encrypted networks, intercepted enemy communications, and exposed hidden operations. Hacking 2 unguarded phones? Child's play. That night, while Sarah slept peacefully beside him, the same bed she had tainted with betrayal, John went to work. He accessed her cloud backups, combing through texts, emails, and thousands of deleted messages. Every lie, every secret meeting, every excuse she had fed him was there in black and white. But then, something even darker surfaced. Money transfers. Mike and Sarah hadn't just been sneaking around behind his back. They had been moving money, his money. Joint accounts, discreet withdrawals, a hidden account under Sarah's name. Thousands of dollars had been funneled out while he was away. It wasn't just adultery, it was theft. John's jaw clenched as he scrolled through more files. Screenshots of fake expenses, forged signatures, Sarah pretending to be him to authorize transactions. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was fraud. And fraud? Fraud had consequences. John knew how to break a person, not through violence, but through fear, paranoia, and guilt. He wasn't going to simply expose them. He was going to make them destroy themselves. Over the next few days, he planted seeds of doubt in Sarah's mind. He would leave his laptop open, just enough for her to see financial documents on the screen. He started receiving calls from a lawyer, a friend from the military posing as legal counsel. Sarah overheard enough of the conversations to feel the tension. At night, he lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, barely speaking. When she asked what was wrong, he would just sigh and shake his head. Sarah started to crack first. She became jumpy, her usual confidence crumbling under the weight of unspoken guilt. Mike was next. He started calling her more, their conversations growing tense. Then, John made his first move. One morning, Sarah checked her phone and froze. An anonymous text. He knows. Her breath hitched. Her hands shook as she reread it over and over, glancing at John, who sat at the table, sipping his coffee like nothing was wrong. Another text followed. He is proof. He's coming for you both. Sarah dropped her phone. Her face turned pale. John smirked behind his coffee mug. That night, Mike called her 3 times. The tension in her voice was unmistakable. "Do you think it's him?" she whispered into the phone. "How could he know?" Mike hissed. "We were careful." "Maybe someone told him," Sarah said, voice shaky. What if he's just waiting to?" "Stop. You're being paranoid," Mike snapped, but John could hear the fear in his voice. "Good." With all the financial evidence in hand, John reached out to a lawyer for real this time, a divorce lawyer, a criminal attorney, and an investigator. He wasn't just going to expose them, he was going to take everything. His next move? A well-timed business trip. He told Sarah he'd be away for a few days again, just like before. But this time, he wasn't just watching. This time, he was setting the final stage. Sarah and Mike had no idea the walls were closing in. No idea that John had already frozen accounts, gathered legal documents, and prepared for the moment when he would strike the killing blow. The only question left was, how brutal would it be? John wasn't just going to expose them, he was going to break them. He had spent years in the military, learning how to dismantle an enemy without ever firing a bullet. Psychological warfare was just as effective as physical combat, and now, Sarah and Mike were his targets. Their biggest weakness? Guilt. Fear. Paranoia. And John was about to feed those emotions until they devoured them whole. It started with small, almost unnoticeable changes. Sarah would leave her jewelry on the nightstand, only to find it in the bathroom drawer. Mike's favorite jacket disappeared for 2 days, then reappeared folded neatly on the bed. The living room clock stopped ticking. Her phone charger went missing. She didn't think much of it at first, until one night, John watched her from the hidden cameras as she paused in the hallway, her breathing shallow. The family portrait hanging in the hallway, the one of her and John on their wedding day, had been turned upside down. She stared at it, her face pale. John smirked from his laptop screen. The text messages. The next night, Sarah received a text from an unknown number. "Did you miss me today? I missed you. I always know where you are." Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She looked at John, who was sleeping soundly beside her. Or at least, she thought he was. The next morning, Mike got a message, too. "She's lying to you. She was never yours. Look closer." Mike immediately called Sarah. "Did you tell anyone about us?" His voice was tense. Sarah was already on edge from the messages, her paranoia growing. "Of course not. You think I'd be that stupid?" "I don't know," Mike snapped. "But someone knows. And if John finds out—" "He won't," she interrupted. "He's not that smart." John chuckled to himself as he read the messages in real time. Oh, but he was. John knew how trust worked. And more importantly, he knew how to destroy it. Sarah and Mike's little secret had been built on lust and lies, but once doubt entered the equation, it would collapse like a house of cards. John made sure to fan the flames. One night, Sarah woke up to find John's military knife on her bedside table. She gasped, looking at John, who was still sleeping soundly. She grabbed it with shaking hands and tucked it in the drawer. But as she turned to her phone, another message appeared. "He's watching you. He always has." She barely slept that night. Mike, on the other hand, was beginning to doubt Sarah. Every time they talked, she seemed distracted, her nerves frayed. Then one evening, as they met in a motel, Mike noticed something. Sarah's perfume, it smelled different. Not like the one she always wore for him. No, it smelled like John. A chill ran down his spine. Had she been with him before coming here? "Did you sleep with him?" Mike asked suddenly. Sarah's eyes widened. "What? No. Why would you even? Then why do you smell like him?" Sarah swallowed, realizing she had no answer. She hadn't slept with John in weeks, yet somehow, she did smell like him. Because John had switched her perfume. Mike's face darkened with suspicion. Doubt had officially taken root. John watched it all unfold from the shadows. Sarah was on edge, checking her phone constantly, jumping at every noise. Mike was growing distant, his patience wearing thin. The tension between them was fracturing their affair, and John was only getting started. One night, after another anonymous message warning Mike that Sarah had been keeping secrets from him, Mike snapped. "I don't trust you anymore," he spat at her. Sarah's eyes widened. You're being paranoid. Am I? Mike scoffed. Then why do I feel like someone is laughing at us? Because someone was. John, watching from a hidden camera, leaned back with a smirk. Now, it was time for the final strike. John had spent weeks setting this up, gathering proof, playing mind games, breaking them from the inside. Now, it was time to end it. And what better stage than Sarah's own birthday party? The invitations had been sent. A small, intimate gathering at their home. Family, close friends, even Mike's wife, Lisa, was coming. Sarah had no idea what was waiting for her. John made sure she felt relaxed, unsuspecting. He played the perfect husband, surprising her with flowers, whispering how much he loved her. She smiled, believing she had one. She had no clue she was about to lose everything. The party begins. The house buzzed with laughter and chatter. Sarah was in her element, hugging guests, sipping wine, basking in attention. Mike stood in the corner, tense, his eyes darting around the room. Ever since the anonymous texts started, he had been paranoid. But tonight, he tried to push it aside. John? He was calm. Too calm. Then, just before the cake was brought out, John clinked his glass. Before we celebrate my beautiful wife's birthday, he said, his voice steady, I have a special surprise. Sarah smiled, tilting her head. John, what are you up to? He gestured toward the projector screen. A little tribute to our marriage. To trust. To loyalty. Sarah's face faltered, just for a second. Then, the video started playing. At first, the guests smiled, expecting old wedding pictures or vacation clips. Then, the footage changed. The hidden camera's clear, undeniable evidence flickered onto the screen. Sarah and Mike. Together. In John's house. In his bed. Gasps echoed through the room. Someone dropped a glass, it shattered against the floor. Sarah went stiff, her face draining of color. Mike froze. The next clip played, screenshots of their secret messages. I can't wait for him to leave again. I just want you. I wish we didn't have to hide. Then, the final blow, bank statements. Sarah had stolen from John. Mike had helped. The room erupted. Lisa, Mike's wife, let out a choked sob. She turned to him, her face a mask of devastation. You disgusting, cheating, she grabbed her wine glass and threw it straight at his face. Red liquid splattered across his shirt. Lisa, please, Mike stammered. It's not what it looks like. Not what it looks like, she screamed. You were in his bed. Sarah, shaking, turned to John. Tears welled in her eyes. She was losing control. John, baby, please, she whispered, reaching for him. This isn't, I can explain. John stepped back. Explain, he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Explain how you betrayed me? Stole from me? Slept with him in our home? Sarah fell to her knees, sobbing. I made a mistake. I love you, I swear. Please don't do this. John didn't even blink. Happy birthday, Sarah, he said coldly. Then, he turned to the guests. Party's over. One by one, people walked out, shaking their heads in disgust. Lisa stormed out, leaving Mike standing there, drenched in wine, humiliated. John didn't stay to watch Sarah completely fall apart. He had seen enough. Justice had been served. Sarah and Mike thought the worst was over. They were wrong. John hadn't just wanted to humiliate them, he wanted to erase them. And now, it was time for ruthless payback. Sarah woke up in a cheap motel room the next morning, her eyes swollen from crying. The echoes of last night's disaster still rang in her ears: John's cold stare, Lisa's fury, the disgust in everyone's eyes. She reached for her phone, desperate to check her bank account. Account frozen. Her breath hitched. What? She tried again, logging into another card. Error, funds unavailable. A chill ran down her spine. She called Mike, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Panic set in. Across town, Mike was sitting in his boss's office, his face pale, hands trembling. What the hell is this? His boss threw a folder on the table. Inside were bank statements, transaction logs, evidence of company funds missing. Mike's heart stopped. I don't know, he stuttered. His boss leaned in, his expression deadly serious. We traced it all back to you, Mike. You're fired. And the company's pressing charges. Mike's stomach twisted. This wasn't happening. But it was. And John had made sure of it. Sarah ran to her house, her last hope. Maybe she could talk to John, beg him to take her back. But when she got there, the locks had been changed. She banged on the door. John. Please, let me in. We can fix this. Silence. Then, a voice behind her. You don't live here anymore. She turned. John stood there, arms crossed, eyes cold. John, please, she whispered, tears spilling. I have nothing left. That's not my problem. He pulled out an envelope and tossed it at her feet. Divorce papers. Sarah fell to her knees. Don't do this. John stepped closer, his voice a whisper. You did this to yourself. Then, he walked inside, slamming the door behind him. Mike's wife, Lisa, had wasted no time. By the end of the week, she had packed up her things, taken the kids, and filed for divorce. Mike tried calling her, begging. But she was done. You destroyed our family, she said, voice shaking. I never want to see you again. The last thing she sent him was a photo of the kids waving goodbye. And just like that, Mike had lost everything. John sat on his porch that evening, whiskey in hand, watching the storm roll in. His phone buzzed, a text from a mutual friend. Mike got evicted. Sarah's been staying at a shelter. They have nothing left. John took a slow sip of his drink, staring into the distance. He felt nothing. No regret. No pity. Just satisfaction. They had taken his love, his trust, his life, and he had taken everything back. John smirked. Game over. John stood in the middle of his now empty house, the echoes of the past lingering in the air. This place had once been his home. Now, it was nothing but a battlefield, one he had conquered. The last few weeks had been a storm, but now, it was over. Sarah was gone. Mike was ruined. And John? He was free. His duffel bag sat by the door, his only luggage. Everything else? Sold. Donated. Left behind. No more ghosts. No more memories. He picked up his keys, taking one last glance around. The house was silent. No laughter, no whispered lies. Just peace. John smirked. Then, without hesitation, he walked out and never looked back. At the airport, John handed over his one-way ticket. Destination? Somewhere far. Somewhere new. As he walked through security, he heard his name. John. He turned. Sarah stood at the entrance, tears streaming down her face. She looked broken, desperate. Please, she sobbed. Don't go. I love you. I'll change. I swear, I'll fix this. John stared at her. He felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. Not even hate. Just indifference. He stepped closer, leaned in, and whispered the last words he would ever say to her. "You don't exist to me anymore." Then, he turned away. Sarah collapsed to the floor, sobbing. But John? He kept walking. The plane took off, the city fading beneath him. As he stared out the window, John took a deep breath. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Not because he had destroyed them, but because he had rebuilt himself. And now, his new life was just beginning.